Step over here. I need you to keep your hands visible.
I'm on my own property. What's the issue?
We're responding to a call. You fit the description.
What description? I'm watering my lawn.
Ma'am, comply with my instructions.
Okay, this is my ID.
That doesn't change anything right now.
You can check
5
it if
seconds.
you want.
The interaction was taking place in a quiet residential area just outside a mid-sized city. It was early evening, a time when neighbors were returning home and routine calls were common. The officer had been dispatched after a report came in about a suspicious person seen moving between yards. The caller did not report a crime in progress. No tools, weapons, or forced entry were mentioned. The description passed to the officer was limited: an adult female, average height, dark clothing. When the officer arrived, the woman was standing on her own property near the front of her house. She was holding a garden hose and had no items suggesting criminal activity. From the officer's perspective, she matched the general description given over the radio. From the woman's perspective, she was doing a normal household task on land she legally occupied. The officer approached using standard contact procedures. He asked her to step forward and keep her hands visible. These instructions were consistent with safety training and did not involve force. At the same time, he did not clearly explain what crime he was investigating or why she was being detained rather than questioned voluntarily. The woman asked for clarification. She wanted to know why she was being stopped and what probable cause existed. Her questions were calm and direct. She did not raise her voice or attempt to leave. She did not refuse to speak. Instead, she tried to establish the legal basis for the encounter. At that point, the officer relied on the original call. In many departments, officers are trained to control the scene first and sort out details later. That approach can work when a real threat exists. It can also create problems when the information behind the call is weak. In this case, the description was broad and the environment did not show signs of a crime. When the woman presented her government-issued identification, it was not done as a display of authority. It was offered as context. The ID indicated federal employment, but it did not explain why she was being stopped in the first place. The officer viewed it as unrelated to the immediate situation. From his standpoint, identity did not negate the need to resolve the call. What neither of them knew at that moment was how differently the encounter would be judged once reviewed later. Body camera footage would capture the exact words used. Dispatch logs would show what information had been provided. The absence of a specific suspect description would become significant. Situations like this often escalate not because of hostility, but because of incomplete information. The officer believed he was acting within procedure. The woman believed her rights were being ignored. Both assumptions existed at the same time, and neither side had enough shared facts to resolve the misunderstanding quickly. As the interaction continued, the issue was no longer just the original call. It became about authority, verification, and whether the stop itself was justified. That shift would later shape internal reviews, legal analysis, and public reaction once the encounter became known outside the neighborhood. At this stage, however, none of that had happened yet. It was still just one officer, one resident, and a call that had not been fully explained. The outcome would depend on what happened next. The woman involved had lived in the neighborhood for several years. She kept a regular routine and was known to nearby residents as quiet and private. On most days, she left home early and returned in the evening. Her work schedule was structured, and she rarely discussed her job outside of close professional circles. She was employed by the Defense Intelligence Agency, an organization responsible for analyzing foreign military capabilities and national security threats. Her role was not public-facing. She worked primarily in secure office environments, reviewing data, preparing reports, and supporting senior analysts. The position required a high level of clearance, strict adherence to procedure, and discretion in everyday life. She did not carry a weapon for her job, nor did she have any law enforcement authority. Within her workplace, she was regarded as reliable and methodical. Performance reviews described her as detail-oriented and calm under pressure. She had no disciplinary record and no history of conflict with colleagues. Her supervisors trusted her to handle sensitive material and meet deadlines without supervision. Outside of work, her life was routine. She maintained her home, handled errands on weekends, and kept limited social engagements. She did not draw attention to herself. On the day of the incident, she had returned from work earlier than usual and was taking care of basic household tasks before dark. This was not the first time she had been questioned in a setting where she did not expect it. Years earlier, while entering a secured office building where she was fully authorized, she had been stopped and asked to confirm her credentials after another employee assumed she was in the wrong place. The situation was resolved quickly once identification was checked. It was noted, then forgotten. That earlier moment did not carry lasting impact, but it reinforced a habit she had developed over time. When questioned, she responded by asking for clarity and relying on documentation rather than argument. She believed procedures existed to prevent misunderstandings. That approach shaped how she responded during the encounter at her home. She did not see the situation as confrontational. She viewed it as an error that could be corrected once the right information was shared. At that moment, she expected the interaction to end the same way earlier misunderstandings had, quietly and without consequence. She had no indication that this time would be different. The officer arrived alone in a marked patrol vehicle and parked along the curb a short distance from the house. There were no emergency lights activated. Traffic moved normally along the street, and the surrounding homes appeared quiet. A radio call could be heard briefly before the officer stepped out of the vehicle and approached the front yard. The woman was standing several feet from the house, holding a garden hose and directing water toward a dry patch of grass near the walkway. She noticed the patrol car as it stopped but did not change what she was doing. When the officer spoke, she turned toward him, keeping the hose in her hand. He asked her to step forward and keep her hands visible. His voice was firm but even. She complied by turning fully toward him and lowering the hose so it rested against the ground. Water continued to run briefly before she shut it off. The officer positioned himself a few feet away, maintaining distance. He asked basic questions, whether she lived at the address, whether she had seen anyone else in the area, and what she was doing outside. She answered each question directly. She stated that she lived there and was watering her lawn. At that point, the officer referenced the call he had received. He said someone matching her description had been reported acting suspiciously. He did not specify what behavior had been described. When she asked what made the behavior suspicious, he repeated that he was responding to a report and needed to sort it out. As she shifted her weight and adjusted her grip on the hose, the officer told her to stop moving and keep her hands where he could see them. The movement was minor and consistent with holding the hose, but it drew his attention. She paused and asked if she was being detained or free to go back inside. He did not answer the question directly. Instead, he told her to remain where she was while he confirmed information. The exchange remained calm, but the lack of clear explanation began to slow the interaction. Neither person raised their voice. Neither stepped closer. The officer requested identification. She reached slowly into a pocket and removed her wallet, explaining what she was doing before each movement. She handed over her driver's license first. The officer looked at it, then returned it, saying he still needed to resolve the call. She asked again what the suspected offense was. He replied that he needed her to cooperate so he could complete his investigation. The conversation continued in this pattern, questions followed by partial answers, instructions followed by compliance, without resolution. As the minutes passed, the normal sounds of the neighborhood continued. A car drove by. A door opened and closed down the street. The interaction remained contained, but the uncertainty was growing. The situation had not escalated, yet it had not been resolved either. After several minutes of the initial exchange, the officer repeated that she matched the description from the call. He requested that she step closer to the patrol vehicle. She declined politely, explaining again that she was on her own property and had no connection to the reported activity. Her tone remained calm and neutral, and she maintained visible hands at all times. At this point, a neighbor walked by on the sidewalk. They slowed, glanced toward the front yard, and continued on their way without interacting. The presence of a witness was minimal and unobtrusive, offering no intervention or commentary. Their brief appearance, however, underscored the visibility of the encounter. The officer asked if she had been in the area earlier that day, citing the time of the reported incident. She responded that she had been at work and only returned in the late afternoon. The officer paused and glanced toward the house, apparently considering the timeline, but returned to his assumption that she was connected to the call. She then presented her federal identification, stating her employment and security clearance. The officer examined it briefly and set it aside, commenting that it did not alter the situation. He repeated instructions to comply with his requests. The woman asked again what probable cause existed for the stop. He did not provide specifics beyond referencing the initial call. During this exchange, she experienced a moment of concern. Though the interaction had been calm, she recognized that continued dismissal of her clarification could lead to further complications. She did not display panic or resistance, but noted internally that the officer had the authority to escalate if he chose to. A minor gesture she made, adjusting her position near the walkway, was misinterpreted by the officer as evasive. He asked her to stand still. She complied immediately, pausing while keeping her hands visible. This small misreading prolonged the interaction without introducing overt conflict. For several more minutes, the dialogue repeated in a pattern, the officer issuing instructions, the woman clarifying her position, and minimal bystander presence. The atmosphere remained quiet, with no threats, no physical contact, and no shouting. Yet the ongoing dismissal of identification and explanation created subtle humiliation, a sense of being disregarded, and a quiet tension in the exchange. Both parties remained composed, but the stop had shifted from a routine check to an unresolved verification. Neither side had escalated physically, but the officer's insistence on compliance and the woman's calm persistence highlighted a gap between procedure and context. The incident was poised to move toward resolution, but not before authority verification arrived. After several minutes, a supervisor arrived on the scene in a separate patrol vehicle. They approached slowly and identified themselves, asking the officer for a summary of the situation. The officer explained that a call had been received about a suspicious individual, that the woman matched a vague description, and that she had refused to follow certain instructions. The supervisor listened without interruption, taking note of the facts provided. Meanwhile, the woman repeated her explanation calmly, stating her full name, residence, and occupation. She presented her federal identification once more, making it available for verification. The supervisor examined the ID, confirmed the information through dispatch and agency contacts, and verified that she was legally present on her property. The supervisor's demeanor was professional and measured, showing clear attention to the details rather than emotion. Upon receiving confirmation, the officer exhibited hesitation. There was a noticeable pause as he processed that the individual he had been questioning was employed by the Defense Intelligence Agency. His previous assumptions were clearly at odds with verified facts. He stepped back slightly, glanced at his supervisor, and lowered his tone when speaking. There was no verbal acknowledgement of error, but his posture and brief silence indicated uncertainty. The supervisor communicated directly to the officer that the initial description had not matched a crime in progress and that the resident was legally on her property. The officer responded by complying with the request to step aside and allow the interaction to conclude. Dispatch records and verification confirmed there was no outstanding threat or investigation connected to the woman's location at that time. The woman remained composed throughout. She did not make statements about the officer's conduct beyond clarifying her identity. The supervisor noted the need to document the encounter accurately for internal review. The officer retrieved his body camera and notes, and a quiet administrative acknowledgement of the misunderstanding was recorded. As the interaction concluded, the tension that had accumulated over the previous minutes dissipated. The supervisor confirmed that no further action was required on the part of the woman. The officer retreated to his vehicle, adjusting to the realization that the initial assumptions had been incorrect. The scene returned to normal, with no further instructions or intervention necessary. The incident had shifted from a procedural stop to a verification exercise. It ended with documented correction, professional acknowledgement of the facts, and no further escalation. The discovery of the truth relied entirely on accurate identification, clear verification channels, and adherence to procedural verification, rather than confrontation or force. Following the incident, the police department initiated an internal review. Officers involved submitted written statements detailing the timeline, dialogue, and actions taken. The supervisor who had arrived on scene compiled a report, noting the verified identity of the resident and the discrepancy between the original call and the information available at the time of the stop. The officer who made the initial contact was placed on administrative leave pending review. The department followed standard procedures to assess whether policies were followed correctly, whether training gaps contributed to the misunderstanding, and whether any disciplinary measures were warranted. Investigators examined body camera footage, dispatch logs, and witness statements to form a complete record. No physical harm had occurred during the interaction, but procedural errors were identified. The department determined that assumptions based on incomplete information and reliance on a vague description had unnecessarily prolonged the stop. Recommendations were made to reinforce protocols regarding verification, property rights, and handling of federal identification. The resident did not pursue legal action, but documented the encounter with her agency, which conducted its own internal review. The documentation noted that the interaction was resolved without escalation and that the officer had ultimately complied with verification procedures. The agency shared findings with department leadership to prevent similar incidents in the future. Media coverage was minimal at first, limited to factual reporting once the review was completed. Articles highlighted the procedural misstep, the verification of identity, and the steps taken to address the officer's actions. Public attention focused on the importance of accurate information in law enforcement interactions, without sensationalizing the incident. Internally, the department updated training to emphasize clearer communication, the importance of acknowledging identification, and techniques for de-escalating situations where assumptions might otherwise prolong an encounter. The review also reinforced accountability structures, ensuring supervisors are notified promptly when verification concerns arise. The incident ultimately served as a reference case for policy adjustments. While no dramatic confrontations occurred, the outcomes influenced both departmental procedures and the awareness of officers regarding routine stops on private property. It demonstrated the role of verification, documentation, and calm professional oversight in correcting misunderstandings before they escalate further. The incident illustrates how assumptions can influence interactions even in routine situations. Officers relied on a vague description, which aligned partially with the resident's appearance and actions. The absence of a clear connection between the reported call and the observed behavior created conditions for a prolonged stop. Such situations demonstrate the potential consequences when information is incomplete or interpreted without verification. From a procedural standpoint, identification and documentation serve as critical safeguards. The woman's federal credentials, once verified, clarified the situation entirely. Until that point, both parties operated within the limits of their understanding, highlighting how small gaps in communication can have disproportionate effects. The scenario also points to the subtle influence of bias in decision-making. Without overt hostility, assumptions about appearance, location, or behavior shaped the officer's actions. The situation did not involve aggression, but it did create a quiet imbalance in authority that could have escalated under different circumstances. Recognizing these patterns is essential for systemic improvement. Policy measures, training, and oversight are central to preventing similar misunderstandings. Ensuring that officers confirm identities, question assumptions, and follow verification protocols reduces unnecessary stops. The incident emphasizes that procedural accuracy and calm assessment of facts are more effective than default reliance on assumptions. In summary, this event demonstrates that even lawful professional actions can result in mistakes when context is misunderstood. Awareness of bias, thorough verification, and structured review processes are key to maintaining trust and safety in routine law enforcement interactions. Observing these lessons can guide better outcomes in future encounters without introducing conflict or force. What do you think about this situation? Have you ever experienced or witnessed a misunderstanding like this in your neighborhood or workplace? We'd like to hear your perspective in the comments. Sharing real experiences helps highlight how small errors or assumptions can have larger consequences. If you found this breakdown informative, consider following the channel for more real-world stories and investigative accounts. Stay engaged, ask questions, and contribute your thoughts. Your observations help create a clearer understanding of how procedures, verification, and communication work in everyday interactions.